Welcome to the Healing and CPTSD Show, a space dedicated to supporting complex trauma survivors through community, resources, and advocacy. Okay, I'll quickly just let's throw some questions at you from the community. How do you cope with having parents who won't acknowledge or understand your trauma?
My question would be, who's asking that? Because not what the name of it is, the person, but let's say that your parents died tomorrow. Does that mean, and they would never acknowledge your trauma, does that mean that your healing is dependent on them?
Yeah.
Or do you want to take response? So what you may as well do is grieve it. Just feel your grief. It really hurts to have your parents not recognize your trauma.
Yeah.
It really hurts. It would really be helpful. But even if they recognize it, by the way, it wouldn't heal you.
Right. It's not going to change it.
As my children could tell you,
Yeah.
you know. But if you're in that position, then if you lost, what you actually is happening here is you're losing some ideal sense of the parents who get you. I got news for you. You never did have parents who got you. That's why you're traumatized in the first place.
Right.
So I'm saying, grieve it, and let go of it. Grief means feeling the pain of it and letting go. That's what grief is.
Yeah.
Grief is recognizing that it's never coming back and there's nothing I can do about it.
Oh, yeah, that's so beautiful.
If you keep demanding that they do, all you're going to get is pushback because they don't want to deal with their responsibility.
Right.
So
they don't want to look at their own shit.
When you grieve it and let it go, they might actually come to recognize it. But don't grieve it and let it go to get them to recognize it.
Right.
You grieve it and let it go for your own sake. That's what I would say. And don't make yourself dependent on their understanding to promote your healing. It's your own understanding that you need, not theirs.
I love that. That's a great answer. What would you say where some people experience, you can have two people who both have an ACE score of 10, but one have become addicted or be very traumatized and have a lot of struggles where somebody else doesn't. Why would that happen?
Well, there's a lot of things happen there. First of all, trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you. The meaning of the word trauma comes from a Greek phrase for wound or wounding. So part of it is degrees of sensitivity. The more sensitive you are, the more it's going to hurt. So from the outside, the same thing can look like it's happening. Like it's like, if a thin skull, if I hit it with a hammer, it fractures. A thicker skull will just have a bruise. That's the first one. So degrees of sensitivity, which are temperamental and largely genetic, I think. Okay. Diseases are not genetic for the most part. Some are, but very few, and none in the mental health field.
Right.
And certainly not addictions, but sensitivity is. So the more sensitive you are, the more it hurts. The more it hurts, the more you need to escape into addiction. Because addiction has to do with the pain.
Right.
Not with what happened to you, but with what happened inside you. What kind of pain did you experience? That's the first thing. The second thing is, if there was even one person in your life who couldn't have protected you from what happened, but could actually listen to you and validate your emotions, you will not be as traumatized as somebody who was all alone.
Right. And
there was no empathetic witness, any compassionate presence in their lives.
Right.
That's the second point. There was a third important point that for the moment escapes me. So why? Oh yeah. I never said that everybody who's traumatized gets addicted. All I said was everybody who's addicted was traumatized.
Right.
But trauma can show up in a whole lot of ways. It can show up as autoimmune disease. It can show up as cancer. It can show up as depression, as anxiety, as ADHD, any number of ways, not just necessarily addiction.
Right.
Furthermore, it also depends on class, gender, and race. So somebody who's traumatized might develop the perspective. So trauma shapes how you see the world, naturally, So somebody might have a sense of the world as, I'm quoting somebody. He said, the world is a dog-eat-dog place where everybody wants what you have. They want your dog. They want your house. They want your wife. And these are your friends.
Mm.
Now, what kind of childhood experience do you think that reflects?
Not a good one.
Yeah.
A traumatized one.
Exactly. This guy became president of the United States.
Mm.
So some people take their traumatic responses, which is to be aggressive and selfish and competitive and utterly narcissistic and deny reality.
Yeah.
But in this toxic world, that can get you into the position of highest power.
Yeah. It's like they boost you up. They're like, oh, good.
Yeah. No.
Going.
No. Had you been a Black woman or a transgender person with those same qualities, you wouldn't exactly make it to the president of the United States or the head of some corporation. So partly it's a matter of your context in society.
Right.
Now, his brother went the other way. He drank himself to death, Trump's brother, because they were so traumatized by their father. And his niece, Trump's niece, Mary, wrote a book about the family trauma. She's a psychologist herself. So trauma can show up sometimes. The impacts of trauma in this toxic world can sometimes show up as a strength.
Yeah.
And if you look at some of the worst dictators in history, like Stalin or Hitler, severely traumatized children.
Yeah. Yeah. So heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Heartbreaking, but it's so important that we're talking about it and we're bringing awareness to it and we're making people understand that this is what's happening. This is why it is. And that's why this book is so important, because it's helping open up those conversations. I'm going to pivot a little bit because I know that I'll leave you with one more that's going to be, I would assume, maybe easy. How can you start being kind to yourself in healing?
Well, by noticing when you are and noticing when you're not. So for example, the person who asked that question, why did they ask it? It's because they want to heal. That means in asking the question, they're being kind to yourself.
Yeah.
So be aware that you're actually being kind to yourself right now.
I love that.
Okay. But also notice when you're not. Notice when you put yourself down. Notice when you make things your fault. Notice when you're not saying no, where there's a no that wants to be said, but you're not saying it because you're afraid of rejection. That's not kind to yourself.
Yeah.
Not to say no when there's a no that should be said.
Right.
You know, so notice it. Don't try to be kind.
Yeah.
Because trying just doesn't work. Notice when you are being kind. And sometimes you're being kind without realizing it. For example, in like listening to this podcast, belonging to this group, it means you're being kind to yourself because you care about yourself. If you didn't care about yourself, you wouldn't be here.
Right.
That's already an act of kindness, you know. But as I say, also notice when you're not.
Yeah. Well, that's the only way you can start to change it.
That's right. Yeah. Well, you know what? From my point of view, it's not even changing anything. It's just once you recognize it, it just starts being so that it has its own power, you know. And when you're telling yourself stories that you're not worth it, notice that I'm not being kind to myself. So notice when you're not, because who's noticing?
Yeah.
The kind, real part of you. And that you strengthen the kind part by noticing when you're not being kind. And don't reject any part of yourself. You know, I was a terrible person. I was an addict. No, you weren't.
Yeah.
You're a person in pain.
Yeah.
So notice the kindness, notice the lack of it. And the kindness will show up.
I love that. Great answer. I think a great way to end it. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak with us today. It has been truly an honor. I know I took a bunch of your time, but thank you so much.
Whoa, stop. Wait a minute. Wait. Are you being kind to yourself when you say, I took a bunch of time? So what you did is you had a gun to my head and you said, Gabor, if you don't spend the extra 40 minutes with us, I'm going to shoot you. I don't remember that happening. Is that what happened?
You're completely right.
Or was it the fact that we had a collaborative, interactive conversation that just took this as long as it took. But you didn't take anything away. So when you say that, you're not being kind to yourself. Do you notice that?
You're right. You're completely right. I
Okay,
love
good.
it. I love you pointing things out like that. I do appreciate you spending this time with me and just creating something so wonderful for the community to experience. And we'd love to have you back on whenever your next book comes out or whenever you want to chit chat.
Great.
Thank you so much again. Honestly, this was such a pleasure and I can't wait for us to talk again.
Thank you, and all the best to you.
If you're interested in learning more about trauma and how it can impact our lives, I highly recommend checking out Dr. Gabor Mate's The Myth of Normal. In it, he dives deeper into the ways in which trauma shapes our behaviors and experiences and provides insightful perspectives on how we can heal and move forward. I truly believe that this book is helping change the conversation around trauma, and I hope you'll consider giving it a read. Thank you so much for being here, and remember, you are not alone. Until next time. Thank you for watching the Healing and CPTSD Show, a space dedicated to supporting complex trauma survivors through community, resources, and advocacy.